Hi, everyone. Just jumping in before we begin the episode to let you know that we have begun our spring fundraising drive. We have a matching pledge for $7,000, so the first $7,000 in donations will be matched. So if you want to support this podcast, support the Institute, and support Jungian education, please just make a donation at jungchicago.org/give, and your donation will be matched one-to-one. Thanks.
Hello, this is Patricia Martin, and I'm your host for Jung in the World, a podcast of the C.G. Jung Institute of Chicago. Joining us today is Paul Bishop, a professor of German at the University of Glasgow in Scotland. He has worked widely on different aspects of analytical psychology and its place in intellectual history. His books examine the history of ideas with an emphasis on Carl Jung, Nietzsche, and Ludwig Klages. Professor Bishop is a former member of the advisory board of Spring, Journal of Archetype and Culture, and is currently on the editorial board of the International Journal of Jungian Studies, as well as the special advisory board of the Journal of Analytical Psychology. He has a new book out, Jung and the Epoch of Transformation, that re-examines the Arthurian legend of Parzival and its influence on Carl Jung. Welcome to Jung in the World, Paul Bishop.
Well, thank you very much, Patricia. Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here. Appreciate the invitation.
Well, it's our pleasure. And in fact, I should say it's our honor. You are one of the most prolific scholars writing about Jung today. And so I jumped at the chance to get you to talk about this important. I think this particular myth has been discussed often in its relationship to Carl Jung and Carl Jung's theories. But today you're also going to kind of clue us in on the relationship between this legend and the Red Book. So I'm really thrilled at the opportunity to chat with you about that. So,
well, no, you're welcome, and that's. I hope we can actually get to the bottom of what the Grail might be. It's a big ask. We might not get there, but I think it's so fundamental for understanding Jung, and it's great to have the chance to explore this myth, this mythology with you.
Oh, great! I kind of want to, when you said Grail, lots of ways to look at it. Your book talks a bit about, well, what is the Grail? It has been a question. What actually constituted the Grail? Can you kind of go through the various renditions, and maybe we can land on what the definitive answer is to what is the Grail?
Well, we can try. Its origins, I think, and the origins of the Grail legend are in part coming out of the Christian tradition and the idea of the cup that was used by Jesus at the Last Supper. Also the idea of the cup in which the blood of Christ was caught as it dripped from his wounds when he was on the cross. But it isn't always a cup or chalice. Sometimes, in some versions of the myth, it's a stone. In a particularly grisly Welsh version, it's a platter on which a kinsman's severed head swims in blood. And most recently, it's been identified with the Bamberg Paradise altar, so with an artistic artifact. But I think the reason why it's so hard to define the Grail is that it's all of those things and none of them, and it can be all of those things, none of them, because it's a symbol. And Jungians, you will know all about symbols, and I suppose I'd define a symbol in the Goethean sense as being the thing and not the thing, and yet the thing. And that's what I'd say the Grail is. It is a symbol. It's linked, therefore, with Jung's idea of the transcendent function. It's something which brings about something which is qualitatively new, and therefore, hence the title, Jung, the Epoch of Transformation, this series of 4 books that hopefully is going to be We're focusing on the idea of the Grail as transformation. And so to come to your question, I think that is what the Grail is. It is a symbol of transformation.
And I can't help but think also, I love that. That's what it is. Symbol of transformation. But I can't help myself from thinking it is also how God becomes real to us is through the energy of a symbol. Like you feel the power, you sense the power of it. Hence, it's the thing and not the thing and yet the thing. That last phrase means you it's resonant within you.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And it's interesting, as you suggest, that there is a theological dimension here, and there's very much a theological dimension to the treatment of the Grail and the figure of Parzival in Wolfram von Eschenbach's great medieval epic, which has as one of the questions that's asked by the young Parzival, growing up as he is, brought up on his own by his mother. He asks the question, what is God? Mm-hmm. And that's the starting point, one might say, of his quest for the Grail, is this question, what is God? He's not alone in doing that. It's also said that the young Thomas Aquinas also asked this question. And of course, for both of them, for both the, how should we say, the quintessential theological mind of Aquinas, and for the Grail is not anti-Christian, but is kind of parallel to Christian. It's also got many, many pagan elements. But it's a kind of fundamental question, what is God? And it's central to Wolfram von Eschenbach's treatment of the myth, is coming to a right understanding of a more complex notion of divinity, but a notion of divinity that is, I think, going to be very, very familiar to Jungians who've read Jung's Answer to Job and his discussions there of the lightness and the darkness that are in his conception of the deity, in his conception of God.
Do you have thoughts on the use of question in the legend? Because the legend very much rests on these important questions that Parzival has. And I would love to hear more about that. Is that unique across legends, that they sort of are centered on these larger, I want to say existential questions?
Well, it's certainly central to the myth, the legend of the Grail, as it's associated with Parzival. One should, I think, also mention that the origin of Wolfram von Eschenbach's epic comes from the French medieval tradition, comes from the story of the Grail by Chrétien de Troyes. And Chrétien de Troyes never finishes it for the simple reason that he died. And Wolfram is kind of ambiguous in his acknowledgement of the importance of Chrétien, because he invents this figure called Payotte, whom he says told the true story of the Grail, rather than the one that he gets from Chrétien. But central to Chrétien's version, and central to the version that's developed by Wolfram as well, is this sense of questions that you should and shouldn't ask. And Parsifal, when he's given the advice by Gurnemanz, don't go around asking too many questions. Then when he's in the Grail castle and sees the ceremony, fails in Chrétien's version to ask the question, whom does the Grail serve? Mm-hmm. In Wolfram von Eschenbach's version of it, the question that he doesn't ask is, what ails thee? Mm-hmm. To the suffering, the wounded, and fortis. So they're obviously not the same question, but I wonder if we can relate both of those versions to the fundamental question which is asked by Jung, as he puts it in Memories, Dreams, Reflection, when he says the key question one has to ask oneself is, does one have a relation to the infinite?
Yes, I also wonder how that question takes one out of oneself, meaning my understanding of Carl Jung's appreciation for the numinous is that it takes one out of oneself and into a reality that is commingled with the other. Do I have that right? Does that apply here to this legend?
Oh yes, yes, yeah. No, you absolutely have that right. The whole point about the question which Parzival fails to ask is that it isn't simply a question of it being a question for him. It's the consequences of the failure to ask that question for the whole of society. And in fact, the morning after, the evening when he's seen the Grail ceremony in the Grail castle and failed to ask the question, what ails thee, of Amfortas, the next morning they've all packed up shop and gone away. And he's left looking around saying, well, where did everybody go? And he's called by one of the young servant knights. He's called a goose. He's called a silly goose because he's failed to ask the question. And the consequences of that are not just the Parsifal himself, who has yet to discover his identity as being the Grail King. The consequence is going to be a social one, because there's the association between the Fisher King and the idea of the wasteland, the arid land, the land. Just as the Fisher King suffers, so the land suffers, until it can be brought transformation, and that transformation is unlocked by Parsifal asking the question. And so it is very much about other people. It is very much taking him out of himself.
Let's talk about the Fisher King, because it's loaded, I think, with symbolism. And it's a pivotal part of the story, of the legend. Mm-hmm. So tell us about the Fisher King and how it functions in that legend.
Well, we find this figure of the Fisher King in Chrétien d'Audroy's version, and it's taken over into the version that Wolfram gives us. There are a few differences. First of all, the Fisher King gets a name. He's called Anfortas, hence the idea of the Anfortas wound, some terrible injury. Intriguingly, Jung talks about his own father, Johann Paul Achilles Jung, as having had an Amfortas wound. And through the version of the myth as we know it, through Wagner's Parsifal, this is often associated with sexuality, a wounding of sexuality. So the Fisher King gets a name called Amfortas. Wolfram describes the wound as being the punishment that's meted out on Amfortas for wooing a woman who's not meant for him. There's something very strange about this Grail, that its keepers can only have the women that the Grail has chosen for them. And it causes him, it's the source of great pain and suffering. And there's an extraordinary bit where we're described just how painful the wound is. Amfortas is screaming. The wound has this stench, which is horrible to have to open all the windows. It's very, very, very concrete. And so typical of symbolism, one have something which is very bodily and physical on the one hand, and something which is very, very spiritual, significatory, symbolic on the other. The thing and not the thing, and yet the thing, and so on, that we've been talking about. And as I said, with the Chrétien, we don't know what happens in the end because the epic is left unfinished. But in Wolfram's version, Parzival comes back the second time, sees the Grail ceremony. This time he does ask the question, thereby curing the Fisher King, thereby also unlocking his own identity as being the keeper of the Grail King. Amfortas, it turns out, is in fact his maternal uncle. Very, very, everybody's related to everybody else in Wolfram von Eschenbach's version of the epic, and this then gives the basis for the reconciliation between individuals, the coming together of society and the court, the rejuvenation of the wasteland, which brings his epic to a close.
So there is something essential about initiation into identity that is a powerful source of restoration in this legend, it strikes me. And I want to talk a little bit more about how identity and individuation, Carl Jung's theory of individuation, is played out in this legend.
No, that's it's a key element of what Wolfram is doing, and I think also then provides a matrix for being clear about what Jung is trying to do with his theory of individuation. First of all, the initiatory aspect of it, I think, is related to the idea of the Grail as being not simply mysterious, but in its same way a mystery. So we have the idea proposed by scholars like Jesse L. Weston that the basic idea of the Grail legend represents an initiation into the cult of Adonis. Other critics, Henry and René Cahan, point out that the Grail legend combines Christian legend on the one hand, Celtic folklore on the other, the corpus hermeticum on one side, and also the initiation into the mysteries of Isis that one finds at the end of Apuleius' Metamorphoses. So the legendary sources of the Grail have this idea of an initiation. And it's been picked up by some relatively recent readers of the Grail legend. I'm thinking of critics in the 20th century, such as Julius Evola, in his book, The Mystery of the Grail, Initiation and Magic and the Quest of the Spirit. And also Rudolf Steiner, a problematic figure, I know, for some. But there's an interesting collection of his essays edited by Matthew Barton called The Mysteries of the Holy Grail, From Arthur and Parzival to Modern Initiation. So there's, I think, good reason to see initiation as being a key element here. And it's tied up with the idea of one's own identity. And the problem with Parzival is, as he starts off, his sense of identity, his sense of a place in the world is very much governed by him being brought up on his own, by his mother in the forest, leaving to one side the very, very complicated backstory that Wolfram provides us with. And he asks this question, what is God? And his mother, Herzeloid, gives him a kind of very basic theology. But there's one thing she doesn't want to happen to her son, Parzival. She doesn't want him to get caught up in the knightly world of chivalry. She doesn't want him to get caught up in the world of court. And so she dresses him up as a fool to try and deter people from taking him seriously. And there is this quality in Parzival of being dumm, as the Middle High Germans put it, of being stupid and as being foolish. And yet, this foolish, stupid child is, at the end of the epic, going to have been revealed as being himself the next keeper of the Grail, the next Grail king.
So part of the foolishness, foolishness is really, it's a bow to innocence as well. There is something.
Absolutely, yes. And it's about, and how does that innocence survive in the real world, in the world of society, which is represented by King Arthur's court. And significantly, in Wolfram's version of the tale, there's a sense that always already, as postmodernists say, things are not as they should be in the Arthurian courts. And Kundry, when she arrives the first time, in fact, castigates not just Parzival for not asking the question, but castigates the world of the court as well. So you're absolutely right, Patricia, that we're dealing with how does one bring innocence, as it were, the essence of one's being, into the world, and allow that to unfold and to express itself and to transform what is in that social environment in which one grows up. And so I think a striking image that we find at one point is Parsifal, after he's fought a battle with a knight and won it, dons the armor of the knight, but keeps foolish clothing on beneath him. And I think that's all these Jungian themes about identity, about the mask, about the persona, all of this kind of stuff, I think, is swirling around in Wolfram's treatment of the epic as well.
So this particular legend was a favorite of Jung's. You make that point in the book. And one of the favorite characters, or, a character that really drew Jung's attention was the character of Merlin. Can you talk a little bit more about how Merlin was so, why that character was so attractive to Carl Jung and what it says about Carl Jung?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Of course, the figure of Merlin is very much tied up with Arthurian tradition, Arthurian legend, of which the Grail is one particular stream. In his description of the tower at Bollingen, he talks about wanting to chisel on the back of a special stone le cri de Merlin, the cry of Merlin. But there's something crucial about this cry of Merlin that one hears in the forest. You can hear it, but you cannot understand it. You can hear it, but you cannot interpret it. This means, says Jung, that Merlin lives on in an unredeemed form, that he still walks abroad, but that he's fundamentally understood. And Jung goes on, intriguingly, to suggest that there are three ways in which the secrets of Merlin is carried on. In alchemy, in the figure of Mercury, the spiritus mercurialis. Second, as Wotan, the Germanic counterpart to Mercury or Hermes. And of course, Wotan is a key figure, as we know, in black books. And then thirdly, Jung says in analytical psychology, where Merlin remains uncomprehended to this day. So Merlin is an absolutely fascinating figure. And it's interesting that in the study of the Grail legend that Jung's wife, Emma Jung, wrote, and which was completed by Marie-Louise von Franz in this book published in the 1960s, I think it was, called The Grail Legend. They devote 4 or 5 chapters to the figure of Merlin. So that would be a good way to take one's interest in Merlin forward in the Jungian world, even if Jung himself isn't telling us about him. Through the figure of Emma Jung and Marie-Louise von Franz, Merlin certainly very much is alive in analytical psychology.
That reminds me, I was curious to ask you about the larger purpose that you can speak to about Jung's appreciation for legend and fairy tales. It strikes me always when I read the work of Jung, and Freud too, for that reason, the same is true, is that there's a having to craft a language for psychological material that had no pre-existing, there was no pre-existing lexicon. And so they are having to describe very abstract concepts. And I wonder if you have thoughts on whether or not Jung was appreciating and using fairy tales and legends in order to concretize these concepts for people, or if it was something else. Was he on to something else? Was he trying to take sort of Western culture and knit it in to his theories, to create a broader fabric? Or is it a third thing entirely? I'm curious.
Yeah, no. I think your description is an apt one. That what he's trying to do is really an enormous effort at cultural retrieval, at trying to retrieve and make useful the culture of the West. I mean, that's why the 20 volumes of the collected works are like a little education themselves, aren't they? I mean, no matter what you think about Jung, reading those 20 volumes, you will learn so much about him, so much about Western culture. So there is a hugely pedagogical aspect to Jung, I think, which anyone can appreciate. But I think there's also a particular sense in which analytical psychology is a cultural project. And I think that's acknowledged in or investigated by William Maguire in his book about Bonningen, when he talks about Bonningen as being an adventure in ideas. So analytical psychology works itself out as being fundamentally a work of cultural retrieval. And in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, there's, I think, a very striking passage where Jung says, I consciously linked my work, consciously, that's your point, consciously linked my work to what Faust, Goethe's Faust, had passed over. We get three things. Respect for the eternal rights of humankind. So the sense of an eternal and everlasting dignity about the human being. Second, recognition of the ancient. So the sense of the primordial, the past, the archaic. The archaic is the persistence of the past in the present. And then thirdly, the continuity of culture and intellectual history. And it seems to me that is what Jung is really important for, because he is a thinker of continuity. That's the essential Jungian idea, as opposed to postmodernist discontinuity, rupture, lack, and so on. Jung's point is, no, there is that continuity. And understanding that continuity as consequences, it's essentially transformative. And so we come back to this idea of transformation as core to Jung's project, as well as being a cultural project.
There's a lot to be said in your book about the relationship between Carl Jung's process of writing the Red Book and legend. And I want to lean in a little bit to the Red Book, if we can. And
sure.
So when Jung embarked on writing the Liber Novus, it seems to me that the creation of the book was part of his personal mythology. I mean, he opens it immediately with the stakes of this project, which is he calls to his soul. Those are high stakes. And he gets our attention immediately by that. And so it's very clear that we are embarking on a journey that is to get to the heart and soul of really who Carl Jung is and what this all means. And so I'm curious to hear your thoughts on whether or not you think that process of writing the Red Book, and creating those images that are so beautifully detailed, as all ritualistic material tends to be. I'm thinking about the Book of Kells, right? There's something about the illuminated manuscript. There's something about entering a place of worship where all the detail is given attention, or the sense of place is made clear to the person who enters. And so how does the Red Book feature, do you think, in Jung's transformation? Did the process transform him? Or is it just kind of a chronicle of his own transformation? Those are two different things.
Yeah. No, really interesting question. Just to pick up on the first part, the Red Book does open with this address to his soul, but prior to that, it opens with those biblical passages from Isaiah and from Jeremiah. And so I think that's again the example. The point that I'm trying to make about this cultural aspect is that the Red Book and the questions that are posed by the Red Book don't just spring out of nowhere. They also spring out of prophetic tradition as well, the Judeo-Christian, the biblical tradition, and that's put there by these choice of passages, many of which come from or are used in the liturgy for Advent. And of course, it was in the season of Advent that Jung starts to have or tells us that he starts to have the visions in October of 1913. So absolutely, there is the immediacy of the call to the soul, but it's also framed by these biblical references as well. It's contextualized, if you like, by these biblical references as well. I think that Jung is producing something which you're right to describe as has his own mythology, and that's why it's, I think, at first sight rather perplexing that we don't have the same old kinds of archetypes that we might know from elsewhere in Jung's writings. Who would have known that Istubar? Who would have known that Gilgamesh was going to be such a crucial figure for Jung, for instance? But I think it's also interesting that the whole question of the Middle Ages is thematized. You spoke about the book being like a medieval manuscript, and yes, that's exactly what it looks like. And in the Red Book, we find this towards the end, this remark that Jung made. He says, "I must catch up with the peace of the Middle Ages within myself," saying, we've only finished the Middle Ages of others. So there is a recuperation of this medieval outlook within oneself. And so it's not surprising that there is, at a crucial moment in the Red Book, an enactment of the Good Friday scene, largely mediated, I think, through Wagner's treatment of Parsifal, but which has echoes. And so, if you like, this personal mythology sits within a whole series of other cultural references. And just finally, on that point you made about the images, about those beautiful and striking images, it's one of the curious things, it seems to me, when Jung is writing about the Red Book in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, is that he's insistent upon the point where he says that the Red Book is not a work of art. Remember where he says there is the deceptive voice of the anima which says, well, this is art, and he rejects that and says, no, it isn't. And it seems to me, well, it's not art in the trivial sense of something which is simply nice. And there are aspects of the Red Book which aren't nice at all. I mean, it is in many ways a disturbing as well as a fascinating work. But that's why I'd also say that it is a work of art in the richer and fuller sense of the term, because look at that calligraphy, look at those drawings, into that language. If that isn't art, I don't know what is.
Well, I can tell, reading your book and talking with you now, Paul, I can tell that there is something within you that somehow you encountered Carl Jung, and you are a scholar across the board. German is what you teach, but there was something about the work of Carl Jung that spoke to you deeply and personally. Can you talk about that? How did you come to Jung?
Yeah, that it's a very good question, and I wish I knew. And from time to time, I try to move away a little bit and look at other people like Ludwig Klages, for example. But Jung keeps pulling me back in again, and I suppose the Red Book would be another example of that. That, you know, who can escape the vortex of the Red Book? And that's what this series of books, because the plan is to follow up the book on the Grail and Parzival with one on Goethe's Faust, one on Nietzsche's Zarathustra, and then finally we arrive at the epic, the Jungian epic of the Red Book. Is to try and explain that vortex, and explain that fascination, and explain those links that are there between analytical psychology and German culture that we've been talking about. And so I think the thing that speaks to me about this is this sense of intellectual adventure and excitement when reading Jung. That he always makes such unexpected moves. He brings in apparently obscure, but that just shows how ignorant we are. Texts, traditions. One thinks of his use of myth very early on. One thinks of his use of alchemy later. One thinks of his biblical knowledge, the prophets that we were talking about at the beginning of the Red Book, the whole Judeo-Christian theological tradition as he engages with it in answer to Job. And so I find Jung fascinating, and the one thing I don't understand is why some people don't find him fascinating.
Right. I agree with you. Yeah. What's not to be curious about?
It's strange. It's strange. And Jung is still, in some respects, marginalized by the academy. There are some great Jungian scholars who are out there. But I think that they would agree that as far as the arts and humanities seminar room is concerned, very often today, Jung is not going to be a key figure. But I think that's to the detriment of the arts and humanities. And as the arts and humanities shrink, come under financial pressure, it seems to me that we need advocates like Jung who will say what you might think is an obscure text can in fact be absolutely crucial.
Yes. And I love that you have brought this into our contemporary situation, because I have noticed that a lot of the writing currently in the scholarship in psychology has become very centered around pathology. And, it made me wonder, is the concept of transformation still relevant? Does it still have salience in the profession? What do you think?
It's hard for me to talk about it from a clinical point of view, but from a broader cultural point of view, I would say yes, absolutely, because after all, there are pathological elements to heroes. One thinks, for example, of Siegfried in the Nibelungenlied, or particularly as he's portrayed by Wagner in the Siegfried part of the Ring, or again then Parzival himself, dressed up as a fool by his mother. One could, I think, with good reason, describe Parzival as being badly socialized when he doesn't know how to behave at Arthur's court, for instance.
And he's mocked.
He's killed. Yeah, that's right. And after he's killed Ita, the Red Knight, he puts on his armor. You just don't do that when you've killed a guy. Not in the Arthurian world. It's a big no-no.
I'm glad you said that. I was horrified. The first time I read the legend, yes. I thought, oh my goodness. Now, I thought it was a setup, like, oh, bad things are coming now. Yeah, because usually when there's a character flaw like that that's revealed, trouble's on the way.
Exactly.
Yeah, that'll need to be righted.
Exactly. It shows that he doesn't know what you do and what you don't do. And it's the same with the question, isn't it, really, with Gurnemanz? Because I think what Gurnemanz is saying is, it's not don't ask questions. We wouldn't have any social small talk if we didn't ask questions and so on. But at the same time, there are also questions that you don't ask. And I think it's that lack of nuance in Parzival's, taking this sort of worldly advice, how to get on the world, the questions that you don't ask. But if you find yourself in a Grail castle and there's this massive ceremony going on and a huge Grail is being carried into the room, you've got to ask, well, I think the Chrétien question is, whom does the Grail serve? If you know that there is someone suffering, then asking what ails thee is kind of the most natural question to ask. I mean, if somebody falls down in the street, then you'll go up to them and say, well, look, can I help you? What's wrong? What ails thee? Parzival doesn't do that. He doesn't ask the question. And it's part of the epic dialectic that a failure in one part at the beginning of the process will then lead to, after a series of ups and downs, to setting things right again when he does ask the question. And so that's why the quest is going to be a journey. It's both something which is highly individual, highly individualized, highly individuated, but it's also very clearly taking part in a social context as well, as we've talked about.
Yes, and it is archetypal, meaning universal. I mean, what you just described, this is life.
Yeah, that's right. That's it. Yeah.
Thank you. Paul Bishop, what a pleasure to have you on Jung in the World. I want to thank you for joining us today, and we will link to your book in the show notes. And I wish you well with this work. I think it's important in our times right now to restore interest in this particular legend, because I think people are searching for a little guidance around these issues.
Well, thank you very much. It's been an absolute delight and a joy, a Freude to talk about Parzival with you, Patricia. I'm so grateful for the invitation. I've really enjoyed it. I hope that it's awakened the interest in people who are listening to us, and may all of us find what we're looking for in our own individual quest.
Here's to that. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like more information about training programs, live and self-study courses, archives, this podcast, our blog, or to find Jungian analysts near you, visit our website, jungchicago.org. Thank you to our 2023 donors who gave at the contributor level or above. Barbara Anand, PhD in honor of Fred Maples, S.J., Uni Alcott, Judith and Eric Cooper, David Dalrymple, Mary Doherty, Full Bloom Lotus Center for Self-Awareness, Boris Matthews, Bruce G. and Mary A. Robert Family Foundation, Diane Sherwood, Lawrence C. Tingley, Alexander Wayne and Lynn Kopp, and the Blackbaud Giving Fund. You can support this podcast by making a donation at our website, jungchicago.org.